It was a lazy Sunday afternoon at Joe's Diner, the kind of place that felt frozen in time. The walls were lined with faded photographs of the town's history, old parades, smiling families, and local heroes. The jukebox in the corner hummed softly, playing a tune that had probably been popular decades ago. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the faint aroma of pancakes and syrup, creating a comforting atmosphere. Outside, the sound of a passing car broke the stillness every now and then, but inside, life moved at its own, gentle pace. In one corner, a man sat by himself. He wasn't the type to draw attention. His hoodie was well worn, with faint stains around the cuffs, and his jeans had seen better days. His boots were sturdy but scuffed, the kind of footwear that hinted at long days spent on uneven ground. His hands, wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, told their own story, calloused, strong, with faint scars crisscrossing the knuckles. This was Liam Carter. To most people, he was just another stranger passing through town, maybe someone on his way to the next small town diner. He didn't speak much, and his movements were deliberate, almost slow. But if anyone had looked closer, really looked, they might have noticed something unusual about him. It wasn't anything obvious. No flashy signs, no bold gestures. It was in the way he sat, perfectly still but somehow alert, like a cat resting while keeping an eye on its surroundings. Liam Carter was a man with secrets. But the people at Joe's Diner didn't know that. To them, he was just another customer, someone who had slipped in quietly during the lull of the afternoon. The waitress, a cheerful young woman named Kate, had given him the same warm smile she gave everyone. She'd filled his mug, exchanged a polite word or two, and left him alone. He hadn't asked for much, just coffee, black, and a quiet place to sit. For Liam, this was a rare moment of peace. His life had been anything but quiet, filled with moments that would haunt the average person for years. But Liam had learned to live with the memories, to tuck them away into neat compartments in his mind. Today, he wasn't Liam Carter, retired Army paramedic. He wasn't a man who had faced life and death on the battlefield or someone who had patched up wounds under the most impossible circumstances. Today, he was just a guy with a cup of coffee, trying to enjoy a moment of calm. The door to the diner creaked open, breaking the stillness. Liam didn't look up. He heard the sound before he saw them, heavy boots stomping across the wooden floor, the jingle of chains, and loud, boisterous laughter. The room seemed to shift. Conversations quieted, and the soft hum of the jukebox was suddenly drowned out. A group of bikers had entered the diner. There were 4 of them, dressed in leather jackets with patches stitched onto the sleeves. Each patch seemed to tell a story, names of towns, symbols, slogans, but Liam didn't bother reading them. Their presence alone was enough to change the mood of the room. They walked in like they owned the place, their voices loud, their movements confident and unapologetic. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, glanced around the diner with a smirk. He had the kind of swagger that said he was used to getting his way. Behind him, his companions followed suit, one chewing gum noisily, another tossing a pack of cigarettes onto the counter, and the last one adjusting the chain hanging from his belt. The waitress, Kate, approached them with a hesitant smile. "Welcome to Joe's," she said, her voice a little too cheerful. "Can I get you a table?" Scarface, Liam decided to call him that for now, waved her off with a casual flick of his hand. "We'll find our own, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. They chose a booth near the center of the diner, spreading out as if to claim the space for themselves. Their voices grew louder, their laughter more obnoxious. They barked at Kate for coffee and made crude jokes as she nervously filled their mugs. Liam still didn't look up. He felt the shift in the air, though. The easygoing atmosphere of the diner was gone, replaced by a quiet tension. The other patrons kept their heads down, their conversations now whispers. Even the cook behind the counter had stopped clattering pans, his eyes darting toward the bikers. Liam sipped his coffee, his hands steady. He wasn't the type to get involved, not anymore. There had been a time when he would have stepped in, when he would have felt compelled to say something, do something. But that time was long gone. Now, he preferred to stay on the sidelines, to let life unfold without his interference. But as Scarface leaned back in his seat, throwing a mocking comment toward the waitress, Liam felt a flicker of something. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was more like a quiet disappointment, the kind that settled deep in your chest. The bikers were just being themselves, Liam thought. Loud, obnoxious, sure. But harmless. Probably. And yet, a part of him couldn't ignore the way the waitress flinched when Scarface laughed too loud, or how the other customers avoided making eye contact with the group. Liam's eyes flicked toward the door, gauging the distance. He wasn't looking for an escape, but old habits died hard. He always knew where the exits were, just in case. He took another sip of his coffee. Scarface stood up, stretching as if he owned the place. His eyes scanned the room, landing on Liam's quiet corner. A slow grin spread across his face. "Well, what do we have here?" he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The diner fell silent. Liam didn't move. His gaze remained fixed on the mug in his hands. Scarface sauntered over, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. The other bikers watched with interest, their smirks growing. "Hey, old man," Scarface called out, his tone dripping with mockery. "You look like you've seen better days. What are you, hiding out from bingo night?" Liam finally looked up. His eyes met Scarface's, calm and steady. But he didn't say a word. The diner grew quieter, if that was even possible. All eyes were on Liam and Scarface now, though most people only dared glance from the corners of their eyes. Tension wrapped around the room like a coiled spring. Even the jukebox seemed to falter, its soft hum fading into an almost unnatural silence. Liam tilted his head slightly, his calm gaze fixed on Scarface. There was no fear in his expression, no anger either, just quiet, steady patience. He had been in situations far more intense than this one, and he wasn't about to be rattled by a loudmouth in a leather jacket. Scarface leaned closer, resting one hand on the edge of Liam's table. His grin widened, showing teeth stained by years of bad habits. "What's the matter, Grandpa? Cat got your tongue," he taunted. His friends chuckled from their booth, emboldened by their leader's bravado. Liam finally set his mug down, the gentle clink of ceramic against wood oddly loud in the silence. He straightened slightly, his hands resting loosely on the table. For a moment, he said nothing, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make Scarface shift uncomfortably, though the biker quickly masked it with a louder sneer. "Something I can help you with?" Liam's voice was calm, low, and even completely at odds with the rising tension in the room. Scarface blinked, surprised at the lack of reaction. He had expected fear, maybe stammering, or even a plea for him to back off. Instead, Liam's tone carried a quiet authority, like someone used to giving orders and having them followed without question. It wasn't the response Scarface had hoped for, and it threw him off balance. "Help me," Scarface repeated, his grin faltering just a little. "Yeah, maybe you can. You see, my friends and I," he gestured toward his booth, where the other bikers were watching with smug grins, "we like to get to know the people we share a space with. You know, break the ice, make things a little more friendly." The way he said friendly made it clear he meant anything but. Liam's gaze didn't waver. "Sounds like you've got the wrong idea about me," he replied, his voice as steady as before. "I'm not much for breaking ice. Just here to drink my coffee." The simple statement landed with more weight than anyone in the diner expected. There was no challenge in Liam's tone, but there was something else, an unshakable certainty that unnerved Scarface more than he wanted to admit. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way they were spoken, as if Liam was utterly unimpressed by the entire situation. Scarface straightened, trying to reassert his dominance. He wasn't used to being dismissed so easily, and he wasn't about to let some quiet old man ruin his image in front of his crew. "You've got a smart mouth for someone sitting all alone," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You sure you're in the right place? Maybe there's a retirement home down the road that'd suit you better." Liam didn't flinch. He reached for his mug again, taking a slow sip before setting it back down. His movements were deliberate, controlled, and completely unbothered by Scarface's looming presence. "This place suits me just fine," he said evenly. Kate, the waitress, hovered nearby, her eyes wide with concern. She clutched her notepad tightly, clearly unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. The cook behind the counter shifted uncomfortably, his hand inching toward the phone on the wall. The other patrons remained frozen, their gazes darting between Liam and Scarface like spectators at a high-stakes chess match. Scarface wasn't used to being ignored, and it was starting to show. His grin twisted into a scowl, and he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a growl. "Listen here, old man. I'm trying to be nice, but you're making it real hard. Maybe you should." Liam's hand moved. Not fast, not threateningly, but with purpose. He pushed his chair back just enough to stand up slowly, his eyes never leaving Scarface's. The motion was smooth, unhurried, and somehow more intimidating than if he'd leapt to his feet in anger. Now standing, Liam was taller than Scarface had expected. Though not towering, his presence seemed to fill the space around him. The hoodie and jeans might have made him look ordinary at first glance, but up close, there was no mistaking the solid build of a man who had spent years relying on physical strength and endurance. Scarface hesitated, his bravado flickering for a split second. Liam took a small step forward, closing the already narrow gap between them. His voice, when he spoke again, was barely above a whisper, but it carried through the room like a shot. "You've had your fun. Now, why don't you take your coffee, sit back down with your friends, and leave the rest of us to enjoy our afternoon?" The words weren't a question. They were a directive, and the weight behind them was impossible to ignore. It wasn't a threat, not exactly, but it left no room for argument. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Scarface's response. Scarface blinked, his swagger faltering further. He glanced back at his crew, who were still watching, though their earlier amusement had dimmed. None of them moved to back him up, they were waiting to see how he handled this on his own. For a moment, it seemed like Scarface might back down. But then his pride reared its head, and he took a step closer, his chest puffing out in defiance. "You think you're some kind of tough guy, huh?" he sneered. "Let me tell you something, Grandpa." Liam's hand shot out, not with a punch, but with a firm grip that caught Scarface's wrist mid-gesture. The biker froze, startled by the speed and precision of the move. Liam's grip wasn't tight enough to hurt, but it was unshakable, like steel wrapped in velvet. "Careful," Liam said quietly, his tone still calm but now carrying an edge that could cut through stone. "You don't want to finish that sentence." Scarface tried to jerk his hand away, but Liam's grip held firm. For the first time, there was real uncertainty in the biker's eyes. The room seemed to grow smaller, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Liam released his wrist as quickly as he had grabbed it, stepping back just enough to give Scarface space. But the message was clear, whatever line Scarface had been about to cross, Liam had already drawn it, and he wouldn't allow it to be crossed without consequence. The biker stumbled back a step, rubbing his wrist as if trying to process what had just happened. His friends shifted uncomfortably in their booth, exchanging uneasy glances. The bravado that had filled the room earlier was gone, replaced by an undercurrent of doubt and unease. Liam stood quietly, his expression unreadable. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't say a word. He simply waited, his presence alone enough to dictate the next move. Scarface opened his mouth, but no words came out. After a long pause, he turned abruptly and stomped back to his booth, his shoulders hunched and his expression dark. His friends muttered something, but he waved them off, clearly unwilling to discuss what had just happened. Liam returned to his seat without a word, picking up his coffee and taking another slow sip. The tension in the room began to ease, though the atmosphere remained charged. One by one, the other patrons returned to their conversations, though their voices were quieter now, tinged with awe and curiosity. The waitress, Kate, approached Liam cautiously, her notepad clutched tightly to her chest. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice trembling slightly. Liam looked up, his expression softening just enough to reassure her. "I'm fine," he said simply. And with that, he went back to his coffee, as if nothing had happened. The bikers had settled into their booth like they owned the place, their voices booming over the soft hum of the diner. Plates clattered as they slammed their fists on the table in exaggerated laughter. They nudged one another, making crude jokes and calling out loud orders to the waitress, who was doing her best to keep up. "Hey, sweetheart," one of them hollered, a wiry man with a snake tattoo curling up his neck. He slapped the table hard enough to rattle the silverware. "You got any coffee strong enough to wake up my grandma, or is it all as weak as this town?" The waitress, Kate, forced a tight smile and brought over a fresh pot of coffee. She was trying to stay calm, but her hands trembled slightly as she poured. "Here you go," she said, trying to sound cheerful. Another biker, this one with a shaved head and a collection of rings on his fingers, leaned back in his seat and snickered. "Don't spill it now, wouldn't want to waste the good stuff." Kate managed a shaky laugh, but her eyes darted toward the counter, where the cook stood watching nervously. She glanced at Liam briefly, perhaps hoping the quiet man in the corner might say something. But Liam remained still, his mug cradled in his hands. "Come on, old man," the burly biker with the scar on his cheek Scarface called out. His grin was sharp, his tone mocking. "You been sitting there all quiet. What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or are you too busy counting the years left until your pension?" The others burst into laughter, the kind that filled every corner of the room and made the walls seem closer. Scarface wasn't done yet. He leaned over the back of his seat, his eyes narrowing as he sized Liam up. "What are you, some kind of drifter?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "You look like you've been through the ringer. Or maybe you're just another washed-up has-been, huh? Bet you've seen better days, Grandpa." Liam didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply took another slow sip of his coffee, as though the scene in front of him was no more than background noise. Scarface smirked, clearly taking the lack of reaction as a challenge. "What's wrong? Can't hear me? Maybe you need me to speak louder for those old ears of yours." He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "Hey, old man." This time, a few of the other patrons glanced up, their faces pale with concern. Most quickly looked away again, pretending to focus on their meals or their phones. Kate finally stepped in, her voice firm but strained. "Leave him alone, okay? He's just here for coffee, same as everyone else." Scarface turned his attention to her, his grin widening. "Oh, so you're his little protector now? How sweet." His tone was laced with mockery, but there was something darker beneath it. Kate didn't back down, though her hand trembled as she adjusted the apron around her waist. "He hasn't done anything to you. Just let him be. Let him be." Scarface leaned back, feigning surprise. "You hear that, boys? We're supposed to play nice now. Can't have the little old man getting upset." The other bikers laughed harder, slapping the table and egging him on. It was then that Liam finally looked up. The change was subtle but immediate. The calm, quiet demeanor he had worn like a shield melted away, replaced by something sharper, something that made even the loudest laughter in the room falter. His eyes steady, piercing, locked onto Scarface's. Liam didn't say a word. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The biker's laughter quieted, and even Scarface hesitated, his grin faltering under Liam's unwavering gaze. It wasn't fear, not yet, but something about the way Liam looked at him, calm, calculating, made the air feel heavier. Scarface tried to shake it off. "What's with the look, old man?" he said, his voice a little louder now, as if trying to regain control. "You think you're tough? You think you're gonna scare me with that glare?" Liam's gaze didn't waver. His silence spoke volumes, each second dragging out longer than the last. One of the other bikers, the one with the shaved head, leaned forward and muttered, "Hey, maybe we should just chill. Guy's not bothering anyone." Scarface shot him a glare. "You kidding me? Look at him, acting like he's better than us. Just sitting there like he's too good to talk." Kate took a cautious step closer to Liam, her voice soft but urgent. "Sir, if you'd like, I can get your check. Maybe you can head out before." Liam held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. He finally spoke, his voice calm and deliberate. "No need. I'm not going anywhere." The simplicity of his statement carried a weight that hung in the air. Kate hesitated, unsure whether to stay or move back to the counter. Scarface chuckled, though it lacked the confidence it had before. "Not going anywhere, huh? Big words for someone sitting all alone. You sure you can back that up, old-timer?" Liam took another sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving Scarface's. When he set the mug down, his movements were as calm and steady as his voice. "I'm just here to drink my coffee," he said. "Whether or not you want to make a scene is up to you." Scarface blinked, caught off guard by the measured tone. For a moment, he seemed unsure of what to say. Then his pride kicked in, and he took a step closer to Liam's table. "Oh, I'll make a scene, all right," Scarface growled. "But you might not like how it ends." Liam leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture relaxed but his presence unyielding. "Maybe you should think about that before you try." The other bikers exchanged uneasy glances. The room was thick with tension, the kind that made every sound, every creak of a chair, every breath seem amplified. Scarface opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Liam's expression shifted just enough to stop him in his tracks. It wasn't anger, nor was it fear. It was something else entirely, a quiet, controlled certainty that made Scarface falter. The waitress's voice broke the silence, trembling but firm. "Please, just leave him alone. You're scaring everyone." Scarface turned to glare at her, his fists clenching. But before he could say anything, Liam stood. The movement was slow, deliberate. Liam wasn't a tall man, but the way he carried himself made him seem larger than life in that moment. His gaze never left Scarface's, and when he spoke, his voice was steady as a rock. "You've had your fun," he said simply. "Now it's time to sit down and finish your coffee. Or leave. Your choice." The statement wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable finality. It wasn't a challenge, it was a declaration. Scarface hesitated, his confidence visibly shaken. The rest of the diner watched in silence, waiting to see what would happen next. And for the first time since they had walked in, the bikers were quiet. Scarface's hesitation didn't last long. His pride wouldn't let him back down so easily, especially not in front of his crew. He puffed out his chest, taking a step closer to Liam, and sneered, "You think you can tell me what to do, old man? That's cute. Real cute." The other bikers exchanged uncertain glances. While Scarface's bravado was undeniable, something about Liam was making even the most rowdy of them second-guess their leader's antics. Snake Tattoo whispered something to Ring Fingers, but neither made a move to intervene. Liam stayed still, his body calm but coiled, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. His eyes didn't leave Scarface's. He didn't flinch or step back, didn't raise his voice or show any sign of intimidation. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if assessing the man in front of him. "You're mistaking silence for weakness," Liam said, his tone as steady as ever. "That's a dangerous mistake to make." The simplicity of his words carried a weight that cut through the bravado like a knife. Scarface's grin wavered, but he quickly masked it with a laugh, loud and forced. "You've got a big mouth for someone who's outnumbered." Liam's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smirk. Outnumbered doesn't mean outmatched. The room seemed to freeze, every pair of eyes glued to the unfolding confrontation. Kate, still standing near the counter, looked like she was debating whether to call the sheriff. But something in Liam's demeanor stopped her. He didn't look like a man who needed rescuing. Scarface clenched his fists, clearly struggling to maintain his composure. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who looked as unassuming as Liam. "You think you're tough, huh? Sitting there all smug like you're some kind of big shot. Newsflash, Grandpa, this is my turf now." Liam finally moved, taking a slow step forward. The air in the diner grew heavier with every inch he closed between them. When he stopped, he was just a foot away from Scarface. Up close, the contrast between the two men was stark. Scarface all muscle and bravado, Liam lean and composed. But there was something about Liam's presence, something that made Scarface's confidence falter. "I don't think I'm tough," Liam said quietly. "But I know what I'm capable of. And I know when to use it." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with unspoken implications. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even Snake Tattoo, who had been egging Scarface on earlier, looked like he was ready to bolt. Scarface's jaw tightened, his pride refusing to let him back down. He glanced over his shoulder at his crew, then back at Liam. "Big words for someone with no backup," he said, though his voice lacked the same edge it had before. Liam raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but unyielding. "Backup's a crutch for those who can't stand on their own." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the jukebox seemed to have quieted, as though the diner itself was holding its breath. Kate couldn't take it anymore. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but determined. "Please, just stop this. Nobody wants trouble." Scarface snapped his head toward her, his frustration boiling over. "Stay out of this, lady. This doesn't concern you." But before he could say more, Liam spoke again, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "It concerns everyone when you act like a bully." Scarface turned back to him, his face red with anger. "Bully? You've got some nerve, old man." "I've got patience," Liam corrected. "But even that runs out." The room felt electric, every patron watching with bated breath. A part of them expected Scarface to lash out, to throw the first punch and escalate the situation. But another part of them, perhaps the wiser part, sensed that Liam wasn't a man to be underestimated. Scarface's fingers twitched, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. The struggle was written all over his face. He wanted to assert his dominance, to prove that he was in control. But something about Liam, something in his calm, unyielding stare kept him rooted in place. Finally, Scarface took a step back, though his face twisted in frustration. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood today," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But don't think this is over." Liam didn't respond, didn't move. He simply watched as Scarface turned and stomped back to his booth. The tension in the room lingered, but there was a palpable shift. The bikers, once rowdy and overconfident, now seemed subdued, their laughter muted and their movements uncertain. Kate let out a shaky breath, her shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. She looked at Liam, her eyes filled with gratitude and something else, curiosity, maybe even awe. "Thank you," she said softly. Liam nodded once, then returned to his seat as if nothing had happened. He picked up his coffee, now lukewarm, and took another sip. The room slowly began to return to normal, though the atmosphere remained charged with the memory of what had just unfolded. Scarface sat in his booth, fuming but silent. His crew avoided looking at him, their earlier bravado replaced with uneasy glances at Liam. For the rest of the diners, one thing was clear: Liam Carter wasn't just another quiet man passing through town. Scarface's sneer faltered for a brief moment, the weight of Liam's words landing harder than any insult hurled his way. The room seemed frozen in time, the quiet hum of the jukebox now an afterthought to the palpable tension. The bikers exchanged glances, uncertain whether to laugh or step in, but their leader wasn't about to let it go. Scarface leaned in closer, his shadow falling across Liam's table. "Oh, so you've got jokes now," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Big mistake, old man. Big mistake." Liam didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Mistakes are for people who don't think things through," he said simply. His gaze flicked briefly to the knife on Scarface's belt. "You're about to make one yourself." Scarface's hand instinctively moved to the knife, but he stopped short. Something in Liam's calm demeanor was unnerving, like staring into the eye of a storm. He straightened up, glancing over his shoulder at his crew, as if to gauge their support. They nodded hesitantly, unsure whether to follow Scarface's lead or cut their losses. One of the bikers, the wiry one with the snake tattoo, finally broke the silence. "Come on, man," he said, his voice quieter now. "Let it go. He's just some old guy. What's the point?" Scarface shot him a glare, but the hesitation in his stance was unmistakable. The room hadn't just gone silent, it had shifted. Liam was no longer the target of ridicule but a presence that demanded respect, even without raising his voice or making a move. At the counter, Kate, the waitress, wiped her hands nervously on her apron. She had seen Scarface's kind before: loud, dangerous, always pushing people to their limits. But Liam wasn't like the usual victims. There was something about him, something she couldn't quite place, that made her believe he wasn't just a quiet man in the wrong place at the wrong time. She hesitated, then stepped forward again, her voice trembling but determined. "Please," she said, directing her words at Scarface. "Just leave him alone. There's no need for this." Scarface turned toward her, his expression darkening. "You've got a real knack for sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, don't you?" he snapped. His crew chuckled nervously, but the sound lacked its earlier confidence. Liam's eyes flicked to Kate, and for the first time, a hint of something softened in his expression. "It's all right," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "I can handle this." Kate hesitated, then nodded, retreating to the counter. But her hands still trembled as she gripped the edge, watching every move Scarface made. Liam's calm composure was starting to wear on Scarface. Used to people either fighting back or crumbling under his intimidation, he wasn't prepared for someone who simply didn't care about his bluster. It was as if Liam saw right through him, through all the bravado and bluster, and it made Scarface's skin crawl. "You think you're smarter than me, huh?" Scarface spat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Sitting there all quiet, like you've got it all figured out." Liam finally stood, the movement slow and deliberate. He was an average height, maybe even a little shorter than Scarface, but the way he carried himself made him seem taller. He adjusted the sleeves of his hoodie, revealing strong, scarred forearms, arms that told a story no one in the room had yet to hear. "I don't think I'm smarter," Liam said evenly. "I just know what I'm capable of." The room held its collective breath again. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado fading by the second. Even Scarface seemed to falter, though he quickly masked it with a sneer. "Oh, yeah. And what exactly are you capable of?" he taunted, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Liam didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around the diner, taking in the frightened faces of the other patrons, the nervous energy radiating from Kate, the way the bikers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Then his gaze returned to Scarface. "Enough," he said simply. "Enough to stop you from doing something stupid." Scarface barked a laugh, though it sounded forced. "Big talk for a guy who looks like he hasn't thrown a punch in 20 years. Liam tilted his head slightly, as if considering the statement. "You'd be surprised what you can do when it matters," he said. "When lives depend on it." The words carried a weight that hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. There was something in Liam's tone, a quiet authority, that hinted at a past far removed from the walls of the diner. It was the kind of tone that came from experience, from having been in situations where the stakes were life or death. Snake Tattoo leaned closer to one of the other bikers, whispering, "You think he's a cop or something?" The other biker shrugged, his eyes darting nervously to Liam. "Maybe military. He's got that look." Scarface heard them and scoffed. "Military? This guy?" He gestured dismissively at Liam's worn hoodie and jeans. "He's nothing but a washed-up has-been." But even as he said it, the doubt in his voice was clear. Scarface had spent years intimidating people, but there was something different about Liam, something that made him question whether pushing further was worth the risk. The tension in the diner reached a boiling point when Scarface took another step toward Liam, his hand hovering near the knife on his belt. The other bikers shifted in their seats, ready to jump in if things escalated. The cook behind the counter ducked out of sight, likely reaching for the phone to call the sheriff. Liam didn't move, but his eyes followed Scarface's hand, his expression as calm and focused as ever. "You don't want to do this," he said quietly. Scarface laughed, though it sounded more like a bark. "And why's that? You gonna stop me?" Liam's reply was simple. "Yes." It wasn't a threat or a boast. It was a statement of fact, delivered with such quiet certainty that it sent a ripple of unease through the room. Scarface hesitated, his bravado cracking under the weight of Liam's gaze. The knife stayed clipped to his belt, though his fingers twitched as if itching to grab it. One of the other bikers, clearly nervous, finally spoke up. "Come on, man. Let's just get out of here. This guy's not worth it." But Scarface's pride wouldn't let him back down. He squared his shoulders, his eyes narrowing. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" he said, his voice rising. "Think you can just walk around acting like you're better than everyone else?" Liam's expression didn't change. "I don't think I'm better," he said. "But I do know when enough is enough." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, it seemed like Scarface might back down, the weight of Liam's presence finally breaking through his defenses. But Scarface wasn't done yet. And neither was Liam. Scarface clenched his fists, his face contorting with frustration. His ego was on the line, and backing down in front of his crew was the last thing he wanted. The bikers were watching him, their loyalty balanced precariously on the edge of his next move. Liam stood steady, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. The tension in the air was almost tangible, wrapping around the room like an invisible thread that could snap at any moment. Everyone in the diner seemed frozen in place, waiting for someone to break the silence. Scarface's hand hovered near the knife on his belt again, his fingers twitching with indecision. "You think you're untouchable, huh?" he growled. "Think you can just sit there and make me look like a fool?" Liam tilted his head slightly, his gaze never wavering. "I don't need to make you look like a fool," he said calmly. "You're doing that all by yourself." A few gasps echoed from the other patrons, and even some of the bikers couldn't suppress the faintest smirks. Snake Tattoo quickly wiped the grin from his face when Scarface shot him a venomous glare, but the damage was done. The leader's control over the situation was slipping, and everyone could feel it. Scarface's pride wouldn't let him walk away. He grabbed the back of Liam's chair, jerking it slightly in an attempt to unnerve him. "You're not as tough as you think, old man," he snarled. "One little move, and you're done." Liam remained unfazed. If anything, he seemed more at ease, as though Scarface's attempt at intimidation only confirmed what he already knew. "One little move," Liam repeated, his voice low and deliberate. "And you'll regret it." The words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that sent a chill through the room. They weren't a threat, they were a promise, spoken with the certainty of someone who had been in far worse situations than this. Someone who had walked through fire and come out the other side. Scarface hesitated again, the bravado in his stance cracking under the pressure of Liam's unwavering calm. He glanced back at his crew, looking for support, but their expressions were a mix of uncertainty and unease. Even they could see the writing on the wall. Kate, still watching from behind the counter, couldn't take it anymore. "Stop," she blurted out, her voice trembling. "This isn't worth it. Just leave him alone." Her outburst drew everyone's attention, and for a moment, the tension shifted. Scarface turned to glare at her, his anger now redirected. "Mind your own business, lady," he snapped. "You don't know who you're messing with." Liam took a step forward, placing himself between Scarface and Kate. His movements were slow and deliberate, but there was no mistaking the intent behind them. "You don't talk to her like that," he said, his voice firm. "Not now, not ever." Scarface barked out a laugh, though it lacked the confidence of his earlier outbursts. "Oh, you're her knight in shining armor now, huh? That's rich." Liam didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a moment to study Scarface, as though he were trying to decide whether the man was worth his time. Finally, he said, "I'm not anyone's knight. But I've seen men like you before. Loud, arrogant, always looking for someone to push around because it makes you feel big." The words struck a nerve. Scarface's face twisted with anger, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Liam's quiet confidence. "You don't know anything about me," he shouted, his voice echoing through the diner. Liam raised an eyebrow, his expression unchanging. "I know enough. I've seen what happens to bullies like you when they pick the wrong fight." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the room could feel the shift, the subtle but undeniable change in the balance of power. Scarface, for all his bluster, was no longer in control. Liam had taken the reins, and he was holding them firmly. Snake Tattoo, who had been nervously fidgeting in his seat, finally spoke up. "Wait a second," he said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Liam more closely. "You're not just some random guy, are you? You've got that look. Military, maybe?" The question hung in the air, and for the first time, Liam's expression flickered. It wasn't much, just the slightest tightening of his jaw, but it was enough to confirm what everyone had started to suspect. Kate's eyes widened, and she took a step closer. You were in the military?" she asked softly. Liam didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around the room, taking in the wide-eyed stares of the other patrons, the wary looks from the bikers, and the hopeful expression on Kate's face. Finally, he nodded once, a simple acknowledgement of a truth he rarely shared. "Army," he said quietly. "Long time ago." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that silenced the room once more. It wasn't just what he said, it was the way he said it. The calm, matter-of-fact tone of someone who had seen more than most people could imagine. Scarface's confidence wavered again, and this time, he couldn't hide it. "So what?" he said, his voice cracking slightly. You think that makes you special? Liam's gaze hardened. No, he said. But it means I've faced men a lot tougher than you. And I've walked away every time. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado now completely gone. Even Scarface seemed to be questioning his next move, though his pride still held him back from backing down entirely. You're bluffing, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. You don't scare me. Liam took another step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. He was close enough now that Scarface could see the faint scars on his hands, the kind that didn't come from accidents but from years of hard experience. I'm not trying to scare you, Liam said evenly. I'm trying to give you a chance to walk away. Scarface swallowed hard, his hand inching toward the knife on his belt again. But something in Liam's gaze stopped him, a quiet intensity that spoke louder than any words could. It wasn't fear that kept Scarface from making a move. It was the realization that he was in over his head. The room remained silent as the standoff continued, every second stretching into an eternity. Kate's hands gripped the counter, her knuckles white, while the other patrons watched with bated breath. Finally, Scarface let out a frustrated growl and stepped back, throwing up his hands. Fine, he spat. We're done here. But the way he said it, sharp, bitter, made it clear that he wasn't finished yet. Not really. Scarface struggled against Liam's grip, but it was no use. Liam had him pinned, and every time the biker tried to wrench free, Liam applied just enough pressure to remind him who was in control. Let him go, man. Snake Tattoo blurted, his earlier bravado completely gone. He looked at Liam like he was staring at a force of nature, something unstoppable and beyond his comprehension. Liam ignored the plea, keeping his focus on Scarface. You walk into this diner, he said, his voice low and deliberate, thinking you can throw your weight around, intimidate good people, and walk away without a scratch. But you're not invincible. Far from it. The room was silent except for Scarface's heavy breathing. The other bikers stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or stay put. The patrons sat wide-eyed, their fear slowly giving way to awe. Liam's calm demeanor didn't waver, but his voice carried a weight that hinted at a lifetime of battles fought and lessons learned. You see this tattoo? He asked, jerking his arm slightly to emphasize the insignia now visible on his forearm. It means I've been places you can't even imagine. I've seen men fight for their lives. I've seen others throw theirs away. Scarface winced, his bravado crumbling further. You think you're better than me, he spat, though his words lacked conviction. No, Liam replied evenly. But I've learned the hard way that bullies like you are nothing but cowards, hiding behind noise and numbers. Deep down, you're afraid. Afraid of being exposed for what you really are. His words cut deeper than any physical blow. Scarface's crew exchanged uneasy glances, the cracks in their loyalty beginning to show. They had followed Scarface because he acted like a leader, but now they saw him for what he truly was, a loud, insecure man who had underestimated the wrong opponent. With a final twist, Liam released Scarface, sending him sprawling to the floor. The biker scrambled to his feet, clutching his arm and glaring at Liam, but he didn't make another move. His confidence was gone, replaced by a mix of humiliation and fear. Liam stepped forward, his movements measured and deliberate. Leave, he said, his voice cold and commanding. All of you. And don't come back. Scarface looked at his crew, desperate for backup, but none of them stepped forward. Snake Tattoo avoided his gaze entirely, his earlier bravado replaced by a quiet shame. The others shifted uncomfortably, clearly unwilling to challenge Liam after what they had just witnessed. You heard him, Kate said, her voice trembling but resolute. She had stepped out from behind the counter, her eyes blazing with newfound courage. Get out. Scarface hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of his situation. But he knew when he was beaten. With a growl of frustration, he turned toward the door. "Let's go," he barked at his crew, though his tone lacked its usual authority. One by one, the bikers filed out, their swagger gone. The bell above the door jingled as they left, and the tension in the diner began to dissipate. As the last of the bikers disappeared into the parking lot, the room erupted into applause. The patrons cheered, their fear replaced by admiration for the man who had stood up to the bullies without breaking a sweat. Kate approached Liam cautiously, her hands trembling slightly. "That was incredible," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you?" Liam hesitated, his eyes softening as he looked at her. For a moment, it seemed like he might brush off the question, but then he sighed and spoke. "Liam Carter," he said simply. "Retired Army medic." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words sinking in. It wasn't just what he said, it was the way he said it. The calm, measured tone of someone who had lived through things most people couldn't even comprehend. Kate's eyes widened. You were in the military." Liam nodded. "A long time ago. But some things stay with you, no matter how much time passes." The patrons began to murmur among themselves, piecing together what they had seen and heard. The calm way Liam had handled the situation, the precision of his movements, the quiet authority in his voice, it all made sense now. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Kate asked gently, her eyes filled with a mix of awe and empathy. Liam shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Enough to know that people like them only understand one thing: strength. Not just physical strength, but the strength to stand your ground and do what's right." The cook, who had been watching from the kitchen, stepped out and offered Liam a firm handshake. "You saved us back there," he said. "Thank you." Liam shook his hand, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Just did what needed to be done," he said. Outside, the roar of motorcycles echoed as the bikers revved their engines and sped away. But Scarface lingered for a moment, standing by his bike and glaring back at the diner. His pride was wounded, and the fire in his eyes made it clear that he wasn't done with Liam. "This ain't over," he muttered under his breath before mounting his bike and roaring off into the distance. Inside, Liam watched him go, his expression unreadable. Kate noticed the slight tension in his shoulders and stepped closer. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. Liam didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up his mug and took a long sip of his coffee. "Finally," he said, "if they do, I'll be ready." As the patrons began to relax and return to their meals, Liam sat back down at his table. The tension in the room was gone, replaced by a newfound respect for the quiet man who had proven himself a force to be reckoned with. Kate approached him again, this time with a plate of fresh pie. "On the house," she said with a smile. "It's the least we can do." Liam nodded in thanks, his eyes crinkling slightly at the gesture. For the first time since he had entered the diner, he looked truly at ease. But even as he ate, his senses remained sharp. He knew Scarface's type men like him didn't take defeat lightly. The storm might have passed, but Liam could feel the distant rumble of thunder on the horizon. And if it came to that, he was ready. Scarface's threat lingered in the air like a storm cloud. Though he and his crew had roared away on their bikes, the echo of their engines fading into the distance, Liam knew the encounter wasn't over. Men like Scarface didn't walk away without trying to save face, especially in front of their pack. As Liam finished his pie, he noticed the atmosphere in the diner shifting. The patrons were still talking in hushed voices, but their fear had been replaced with admiration and curiosity. Kate, now visibly calmer, moved between tables, offering reassurances and refilling coffee mugs. An older man sitting near the window approached Liam hesitantly. "Mister," he began, his voice gravelly but kind, "I don't know who you are, but you did something mighty brave today. Those fellas have been terrorizing this town for months. Most of us were too scared to stand up to them. Liam glanced up, his expression unreadable. They rely on fear, he said simply. Once you stop giving them that, they lose their power. The man nodded slowly, digesting Liam's words. Still, he added, not everyone has your experience. That tattoo tells a story, doesn't it? Liam's gaze dropped to his forearm, the combat medic insignia still faintly visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve. He didn't answer right away, as though weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he said, it's a reminder of where I've been. What I've done. The man didn't press further, sensing the boundaries in Liam's tone. Well, he said with a small smile, thank you. You gave us all something to remember today. As the older man returned to his seat, Kate approached, this time with a fresh cup of coffee for Liam. You've been through a lot, haven't you? She asked softly, sliding into the seat across from him. Liam looked at her, his sharp eyes softening just a fraction. Enough, he admitted. Army, she guessed, nodding toward his tattoo. Yeah, he said. Medic. Spent years patching up soldiers in places most people can't even pronounce. Kate's brow furrowed. And now? What brings you to a small town like this? Liam leaned back, his fingers wrapped loosely around a coffee cup. Peace and quiet, he said with a faint smile. At least, that was the idea. Kate chuckled lightly, though the tension in her eyes remained. Well, you're not likely to get much of that if those guys come back. They might, Liam said, his tone matter of fact. But I'm not worried. By now, the other patrons had begun to join in, emboldened by Liam's calm demeanor. A young couple approached, their nervous energy evident as they spoke. Thank you for standing up to them, the woman said, clutching her partner's arm. We've been scared to come here lately because of those bikers. Liam nodded. You shouldn't have to be afraid in your own town. The cook, a burly man with a kind face, chimed in from behind the counter. If they come back, we'll stand with you next time, he said firmly. We've had enough of their nonsense. Liam raised an eyebrow. Standing up to bullies takes more than just words. Are you sure you're ready for that? The cook hesitated, but then he straightened his shoulders. You showed us it's possible. We just needed someone to remind us. Outside, the sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. Liam paid his bill and stood to leave, but he caught sight of a shadow moving across the far edge of the parking lot. Instinctively, he paused, his senses heightened. Kate noticed his hesitation. What is it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nothing yet, Liam said, his tone careful. But they're not done. Not by a long shot. As if on cue, the distant rumble of motorcycles reached their ears. A knot of anxiety formed in Kate's stomach, but Liam remained calm, his sharp gaze scanning the horizon. Looks like Scarface wants a rematch, he said, almost to himself. Kate's hand flew to her mouth. Do you think they'll hurt someone? They'll try to make a statement, Liam said. That's what men like them do when they're embarrassed. But they don't realize. He stopped, his voice firm. Kate pressed him. Realize what? They're not the only ones who can make statements. Sure enough, the bikers pulled into the parking lot moments later, their engines roaring like a challenge. This time, there were more of them, nearly a dozen bikes lined up, their riders dismounting with menacing glares. Scarface led the charge, his arm wrapped in a crude bandage. His eyes locked onto Liam through the diner's window. You thought you could humiliate me, he barked, loud enough for everyone inside to hear. You don't know who you're messing with. Liam sighed, setting down his coffee cup. Stay inside, he instructed Kate and the other patrons. No matter what happens. Kate grabbed his arm. Liam, you can't take all of them on by yourself. He met her gaze, his expression calm but resolute. "I've faced worse." Liam stepped outside, the door swinging shut behind him. The bikers spread out, forming a loose circle around him. Scarface smirked, clearly confident now that he had reinforcements. "You should have left town when you had the chance," Scarface sneered. "Now you're gonna pay." Liam tilted his head slightly, his stance relaxed. "You brought more friends," he said, his tone almost amused. "Guess you needed the backup." Scarface bristled, his pride stung yet again. "We're here to teach you a lesson." Liam's gaze swept over the group, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Last chance to walk away," he said. "You don't want to do this." The bikers laughed, their confidence bolstered by their numbers. Scarface stepped forward, pulling a chain from his belt and letting it clink ominously against the pavement. "We're not going anywhere." What happened next was a blur of calculated precision. Liam moved with a speed and efficiency that belied his unassuming appearance. He disarmed the first biker who lunged at him, sending the man sprawling with a single well-placed strike. Another swung a wrench, but Liam ducked, countering with a swift jab that knocked the weapon from his hands. The others hesitated, their bravado faltering as they realized they were outmatched. Scarface roared in frustration, charging at Liam with the chain swinging wildly. Liam sidestepped the attack, twisting the chain from Scarface's grip and using it to immobilize him in one fluid motion. The remaining bikers began to back away, their confidence shattered. "Let's get out of here," one of them shouted, scrambling for his bike. Within moments, the parking lot cleared, the bikers retreating with tails between their legs. Scarface lay on the ground, groaning in defeat, while Liam stood over him, his expression calm and unshaken. "Next time," Liam said, his voice low and firm, "think twice before you pick on people who just want to live in peace." Scarface didn't respond, too humiliated and broken to muster a reply. Moments later, he crawled to his bike and rode off, leaving Liam standing alone in the parking lot. Inside the diner, the patrons erupted into cheers, their earlier fear replaced with admiration and relief. Kate ran outside, her face a mix of worry and awe. "Liam, are you okay?" Liam nodded, brushing off the dust from his hoodie. "I'm fine." "You just took on all of them," she said, her voice incredulous. "How did you?" Liam shrugged. "Experience," he said simply. "And knowing when to stand your ground." Kate smiled, shaking her head in amazement. "This town owes you more than a slice of pie." Liam chuckled softly, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon one last time. The storm had passed for now. But Liam knew that peace was never permanent. Still, for the moment, he could enjoy the calm. The door to the diner swung open one last time as the bikers stumbled out into the cold night, their bikes revving angrily as they sped away. The clattering of their engines faded into the distance, and with it, the tension in the diner seemed to lift like a heavy fog. For the first time in what felt like ages, the air inside was calm, almost serene. The sound of the jukebox, which had gone silent during the confrontation, slowly resumed. The soft hum of classic rock filled the space, and the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the comforting warmth of the diner. The waitress, still a little shaky, approached Liam, her hands slightly trembling as she wiped them on her apron. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice full of gratitude. "You don't know what that means to us." Liam looked up from his coffee, meeting her eyes with a quiet, steady gaze. "It was nothing," he replied. "You don't have to thank me. No one should have to deal with that kind of fear." His voice was calm, like someone who had seen much worse and simply wanted to move on. But the waitress wasn't done. She leaned in a little closer, her voice softening as she asked, Who are you, really?" Liam took a slow breath, his gaze shifting briefly to the window where the bikers had disappeared. His past, the things he had done, they didn't need to be on display. Not here. Not now. I'm just someone who's been around. Seen a lot. Done a lot. But now. He paused, a faint trace of a smile crossing his face. Now, I'm just looking for a little peace. He looked at the waitress, and for a moment, his eyes softened. But sometimes, peace takes a little action. Kate, who had been quietly watching from the corner, finally approached. She seemed to have found her voice again after everything that had happened. She offered a smile, but it was tinged with a mixture of respect and awe. "You're really something," she said, still a little in disbelief. "You didn't just stand up to them, you put them in their place. I mean, those guys." She trailed off, shaking her head. Liam chuckled softly, the sound carrying a note of weariness. "They weren't the first, and they won't be the last. People like them bullies, thugs, they get by because others let them. But that stops when someone finally calls their bluff." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Kate stood there, nodding slowly as if processing everything she'd witnessed. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Liam's eyes flickered, the briefest hint of something painful crossing his features. But it was gone before Kate could be sure she saw it. He didn't respond at first, choosing instead to pick up his coffee mug and take another slow sip. "Everyone has their story," he finally said, his voice low and measured. "But some stories are better left untold." Kate didn't press. She understood. The past was something Liam kept buried, as most did with the things they didn't want others to know. She could see it now, in his posture, the way his shoulders were slightly hunched, like he was always ready for the next fight. Like he'd seen things, done things that left scars deeper than anyone could imagine. The rest of the patrons, still a bit shaken but relieved, slowly returned to their meals. The tension that had filled the diner just moments ago had dissolved, leaving a strange but welcome quiet in its wake. People were more relaxed, talking in quiet voices, their previous fears replaced by a quiet sense of admiration. The man who had thanked Liam earlier, the one who'd sat by the window, was now sitting back, nursing his coffee. He caught Liam's eye from across the room, nodding once in silent gratitude. There was no need for further words. Liam had done something important, something that had turned the balance of power in the room. He'd stood up to the bullies. He'd taken their pride and made them realize they weren't untouchable. Liam felt the weight of those grateful looks but didn't return the gaze. He had never been one to bask in admiration. He wasn't a hero. He was just someone doing what needed to be done. And right now, that meant letting everyone else go back to their lives, their routines, as if the day had never happened. As the last of the bikers' motorcycles faded into the distance, Liam finished his coffee, then stood up, stretching his arms slightly. He left enough cash on the table to cover the meal and then some, and turned toward the door. "Are you really leaving?" Kate called out, her voice a mixture of surprise and something else he couldn't quite place. Liam paused, halfway out the door. He turned back toward her, offering a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "There's nothing left for me here," he said, his tone soft but resolute. "Just a couple of quiet days in a town that doesn't want any trouble." "But you just fought off a gang of bikers," Kate pointed out, her voice tinged with disbelief. Liam shrugged slightly, his eyes glinting with a quiet amusement. "Sometimes, trouble finds you. Doesn't matter how far you run." Kate watched him as he stepped out into the cool evening, the door swinging gently behind him. The diner was quiet again, but this time it was different. The tension that had plagued the place earlier was gone, replaced by something else, something hopeful. The next few days passed without incident. The bikers didn't return, and the town settled back into its usual rhythms. Liam's presence lingered, though. People spoke of him in whispers, stories of how he'd stood alone against a gang of thugs and won. They spoke of him with a quiet respect, even if they didn't fully understand who he was or why he had done what he did. For the first time in a long while, Joe's Diner became a place of peace once again. The air wasn't heavy with fear. People ate their meals without constantly looking over their shoulders. And every once in a while, someone would glance toward the door, remembering the stranger who had come to their town and left it a little bit safer. But Liam Carter wasn't one for staying in one place for too long. He wasn't looking for praise or recognition. He had done what he needed to do, and now, he would move on. The past was never far behind, and no matter how hard he tried to outrun it, he knew it would always follow him. But that was okay. Because sometimes, the world needed people like him, people willing to step into the fire and make sure the flames didn't spread. So, as the diner buzzed with the sounds of clinking silverware and soft conversations, Liam Carter disappeared into the night once again, his silhouette fading into the shadows. For now, justice had been served. And peace, however fleeting, had returned to Joe's Diner. Liam took another sip from his coffee mug, the warmth of the liquid a small comfort as the sounds of the diner began to settle around him. The world outside had returned to its usual rhythm, but in that moment, everything inside the diner felt different. It was as if the very air had changed lighter, more at ease, as if the tension of the past few hours had been erased by one man's quiet resolve. "Funny thing about life," Liam murmured, almost to himself, as the waitress came by to refill his cup. Her eyes flickered with a mixture of curiosity and gratitude as she topped off his mug, and he caught the quiet admiration in her gaze. "It's not always the loudest person in the room who has the most to say," he continued, a faint, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. His words, simple as they were, held a depth of truth that seemed to resonate with her. He didn't need to say more. She simply nodded, her expression softening. The jukebox in the corner started playing again, an old tune, something slow and familiar. The music drifted over the tables, and slowly, the diner came back to life. The chatter grew again, though it was gentler now. People spoke in quieter voices, as if the earlier confrontation had reminded them of something important, something about strength, resilience, and standing up for what's right. Liam glanced around the room, taking in the subtle changes. The couple near the window, who had once fidgeted nervously, were now sitting closer together, holding hands as they shared a laugh. The man in the booth near the back had returned to his meal, but he was no longer in a hurry. And even the cook, who had watched the whole situation unfold from behind the counter, now stood a little taller, a little more assured. No one in the diner spoke of the bikers who had come in, demanding trouble and finding none. Instead, there was an unspoken understanding between them all. They had witnessed something extraordinary, not in the loudness of a fight, but in the quiet power of one man standing firm in the face of aggression. It was a reminder that strength didn't always have to be loud or brash. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you could do was remain calm, stand tall, and let your actions speak louder than any words could. The door swung open again, and a few new customers entered, oblivious to what had happened only hours before. They carried on with their orders, unaware that the atmosphere of the diner had shifted. To the outside world, Liam was just another traveler passing through, another face among many. But those who had witnessed the scene would never forget him. They would never forget how one quiet man had stood between chaos and order, how he had turned the tide with nothing more than his presence. And maybe, that was the point of it all. Liam was a man with a past he didn't wear on his sleeve, but one that shaped him, nonetheless. He had walked through battles, through hardship, and through loss. His life had not been an easy one, but in the quiet of that diner, he had found peace. Maybe it was fleeting, maybe it was temporary, but in that moment, it was enough. He wasn't looking for recognition. He didn't want to be a hero or a legend. What he wanted, what he craved, was something simpler, a life where people could live without fear. A life where strength wasn't measured by how loud you could shout or how much you could fight, but by how you stood when the world pressed in on you. Sometimes, Liam murmured, more to himself than anyone else, it's the quietest person in the room who has the most power. He wasn't talking about physical strength or skill. He wasn't talking about fighting or winning. He was talking about the power of presence, the power to remain calm, to act with purpose, to make the right choice even when everyone around you is caught up in chaos. He had known that power once, long ago, when he had served the army. The training it had taught him discipline, taught him how to be silent in the face of danger. But it had also taught him the value of restraint, the quiet strength that didn't need to be explained. It was a lesson he had carried with him, one he used again in the diner that day. Liam had given the bikers a chance. He had given them a choice, and they had made it. In that moment, they had learned something he already knew. They had learned that real power didn't come from intimidation, didn't come from force. It came from control, from the ability to stay calm, from the strength to know when to act and when to let go. And now, as the diner buzzed with chatter and laughter again, Liam felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. Not because the world was perfect, not because everything had gone the way he wanted. But because in that small moment, in that quiet space, he had made a difference. Liam took one last sip from his coffee and stood up slowly, stretching as he did. He didn't need to say goodbye, didn't need to leave behind a grand message. The people in the diner had learned something important without him saying a word. And as he walked toward the door, he caught the eye of the waitress again, who offered him a small, sincere smile. He returned it with a nod before stepping out into the night. Outside, the world was waiting, as it always did. The stars hung high above, casting their pale light across the quiet town. Liam paused for a moment, looking out at the road ahead. There would always be more battles to fight, more moments where his calm resolve would be tested. But for now, he had done what needed to be done. As he walked away, disappearing into the darkness, the words of the waitress echoed in his mind: it's not always the loudest person in the room who has the most to say. He didn't have to be the loudest. He didn't have to shout to be heard. He didn't have to fight to prove his strength. He knew, deep down, that sometimes the quietest person, like the still center of a storm, held the most power. And that was enough. For the first time in a long time, Liam allowed himself to believe that.